Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our series of CTO Tech Talks. This month, we are talking to Rob Ellis from Reciprocity about some of GRC things. The method by which we choose these is very scientific. If I get asked the same question 2 or 3 times in a month, I go, oh, we should talk about this. People obviously have questions about this. So we've gotten a few questions about this area and this structure, and we do a lot of work with Reciprocity, and they were kind enough to lend us an expert in the form of Rob. So good morning, Rob. Welcome to this thing. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you, Ken. Thanks for having me. And I've been on a lot of calls with reps from Gotham, and it's been incredibly exciting to win business with you guys. And I'm really excited to come here and answer questions about GRC.
Cool. Why don't you start with a little introduction of yourself, so everyone knows me, but about you and how you got involved with this area.
Sure. So I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Reciprocity, and essentially I used to work in sales and marketing and customer success for Reciprocity. So doing a lot of stuff on the go-to-market side. And in that role, I had the opportunity to come in and pitch and sell and support companies in developing GRC programs, including both services and tools for sort of turnkey solutions. And we saw over time, the mistakes that companies made, but also just the approach and the trends and the successes that they had going from zero to GRC, or sometimes taking GRC programs and scaling them or dealing with changing regulations. And so, I've been able to speak to probably thousands of CISOs and CIOs and directors of security. So excited to be here and to share my insights to the extent that I have them with the whole Gotham team.
Cool, thanks. And sounds like you have the right background for this. So first of all, just to get the sort of, I don't say the marketing stuff, but just the concepts right. Because I think, how do you, when you say GRC, where does that begin and end for you? What do you think? What is the definition of that from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just so everybody, just to level set, I know this is obvious, but GRC stands for governance, risk, and compliance. And really, when we think about GRC and going back several years, it really used to be mostly compliance based, right? So typically the reason people would go do some type of GRC program was they had a compliance requirement to go meet. It could be a single compliance requirement, or it could be multiple complex compliance requirements. And over time, as more laws came out, as more regulations changed, as things like privacy that didn't exist, 6 or 7 years ago, moved to the forefront, we moved from that sort of single check the box to multiple check the box compliance requirements. We've seen a shift in GRC over the last couple of years, moving from compliance focus to more risk focus as well. And, I always think of GRC as like, the joke I always made is, probably 5 or 6 years ago, GRC was like book smarts and security was like street smarts, right? So, you would do GRC because you had to, you'd study for the test because you had to, but it wasn't necessarily as important as having a robust security program. What we've seen as GRC has become more risk-based has been really a merging of, this book smarts and the street smarts into something that can actually go benefit security.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there's like a different culture too. Like when you talk about compliance, and you're talking about, and we're Gotham's a PCI QSA, do some of that audit compliance type work. And, fundamentally, and if somebody could mute, we're hearing some background noise. But what happens with this compliance stuff is you almost feel like, oh, I'm sorry. It's like when people say, I don't hear enough from you. Like, well, you have to hear from your lawyer and your doctor. Like, I'm sorry, you have a compliance need. It's like, I'm sorry, you've got the flu and you need to let's go lay down in bed. So it's a difficult thing, and you take that perspective towards it. And I think this whole risk thing really sort of changes the whole story. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so much more interesting. But I think the compliance culture is a difficult thing to get over.
For sure, right? Because the compliance culture, it's almost, if you think about something like SOC 2, it came out of the AICPA, right? So it's an accounting body that started with it. And it's almost like check this box. We're doing a lot of spreadsheet exercises. We're tapping a lot of people in development and HR and operations on the shoulder once a year and asking them to go dig through their dirty laundry or go into SharePoint or go into Google Drive, or back in the day, go into physical drives and go find files that they hadn't thought about for a year. And somebody's coming on site and they're asking them a lot of probing questions like you would with a doctor. And I would say it's probably about as much fun as filing your taxes, right? Or going to the doctor. And it's also very backwards looking, right? So, you think about an audit, you go through an audit once a year. It doesn't really tell you what's happening moving forward, right? So if you went through and you got your PCI rock, well, that means you were good, really, they looked at last year, right? So you did a good job in 2021. The thing is, you're storing and transacting credit card data in 2022, right? So there is also that element, I would say, of people being like, well, what are we doing this for, right? Like, this is just showing us that we didn't screw up in the past. Who cares about the past, right? Like, we want to show that we're doing well for the future.
Right. I think when we're talking to people, I think we're trying to, like, for PCI, I think particularly, like, it's like job one is to minimize the illness. It's like, how do we subcontract the credit card to another vendor so they can worry about PCI? How do we put it in a small box as possible to limit audit scope? So it's really about, like, limiting the pain. Nobody ever says, well, you should get PCI compliant because it's going to make you a more effective cyber organization. Right. And maybe they should, but it's just, you're giving those kind of, that kind of help, not that it's a real good thing. And I also think that the problem, this part, again, this audit culture of, like, I know when I talk to my auditors that work for me, the PCI kind of people, like, I always feel like I'm talking to Jack Nicholson and A Few Good Men. Like, you want SOC 2, you can't handle SOC 2. Like, like, you just, they have this sort of confrontational aspect, and I think that's kind of harmful as well.
And that's what I think has been really interesting about moving from, compliance to risk, right? Because, if you think about PCI is, like, pretty prescriptive. So, to use Reciprocity in our client base as an example, like, we do work with Walmart on PCI, we do work with Disney Plus, we do work with Stanford. Now, those are really different businesses in terms of their scope, right? You have the largest retailer in the world that's a multinational corporation. You have a company that stores and processes 70 million credit cards, every single month and bills them. And you have an organization that, like, literally just runs a dining hall and a, gift shop where you can go buy a sweatshirt. And they all tackle PCI the same way because it's very prescriptive and very compliance based, right? What we've seen that's interesting is moving to more of these risk-based standards where it's less prescriptive and it's more, hey, we're not just going to sit there and give everybody the same medicine because, okay, you're this age and you're this gender, whatever. We're saying, look, let's talk to you about your risk factors first. Do you exercise? What's your family history? Okay, let's draw your blood. Let's look at this. And based off of this, we can come up with requirements. And that's more of, I would say, a move to, like, an ISO or a NIST or something like that, right? Which is a good second phase in GRC, right? The first phase, as you mentioned, is we do PCI because we take credit cards, we have to do PCI. We try and draw lines around it to minimize the scope. And we try to outsource it, like a Gotham or somebody like that who can go handle it. But the next stage is we say, look, what are we doing to actually get a good security posture? And to get a good security posture, the first thing you want to do is you want to understand your risk, right? It's like, you wouldn't go recommend for somebody with low blood pressure that they stop eating salt, right? So it's like, that's the first thing of the company is you diagnose a risk. And then you can say, okay, look, here's how you actually want to think about compliance, or here's controls you should have in place. And it's much more effective to tackle it that way.
Yes, but what's driving that motion? I mean, right, NIST has been around a long time, ISO has been around a long time. Like, why today are people looking at those as, things they want to put their trust in, let's call it, right? Like, it's a motion of trust into these frameworks, and they've been around for a long time and maybe not sort of underused. I mean, why now?
For sure, right? And so I think it's two things. I should think it's a couple of things, right? So the first is a move to the cloud. And so, as you have more cloud systems, to some degree, it makes it easier to go comply with this stuff, right? Because you can do things like automate and pull evidence, versus going out to servers. So there's some load that you can off shift and some scope that you can draw down, right? So for instance, if you use AWS or Azure or Google Cloud versus if you have your own data center, you can go inherit 30-40% of the controls right there, right? So that's a good step. The second thing is, obviously, as you move to the cloud, I would say things like SOC 2, might be a foot in the door, but it's not necessarily adequate anymore. And so if you think about, like, 5 or 6, 7 years ago, hey, you have a SOC 2, good, you've got a good security program, we want to do business with you. The thing is, increasingly what we're seeing is your risk isn't really, the risk of doing business with you as a company isn't really the risk of doing business with you. It's the risk of doing business with you and your third parties and their third parties, right? So it's like you have this really complex, almost like conspiracy corkboard of, red lines going back and forth. And, you might use AWS, but you do business with a vendor that uses Azure, and, maybe one of their vendors uses GCP, and you've got your data actually floating in almost every single public cloud being used by everybody. And so as a result, we're seeing, just sort of a prescriptive basic framework might be enough to get in the door, but companies actually want a lot more. And so that's really one of those things that is driving, it's sort of change in industry and change in technology is what's driving this shift to maybe something a little bit more encompassing. And I think also just making GRC worthwhile, right? To your point earlier, If it's just a pure check the box, or a pure like, hey, put a Band-Aid on the hemorrhage, it's kind of the bare minimum, right? And it doesn't really tell you anything about the security posture of your business. But if you can get good data in, if you can use something that's a little more encompassing and a little more tailored, it can actually be a useful tool for you.
Yeah, well, and I think there are specific like inflections, and you kind of hinted at the philosophy around it, but like I think I get them all the time. I get third-party questionnaires and third-party risk stuff from my customers, and so having we have a NIST standard we've deployed, getting a SOC 2 to your point, like these would all be very useful things that our sales team needs to effectively interface with customers. I mean, there's a business need to get this thing, and I think I would also point to like the insurance, cyber insurance thing, and sort of the more pressure from there. So I think there are some, maybe you have more things, but there are, besides the sort of the philosophical part, there are some sort of, I don't say guns to your head, but compelling reasons to do this that maybe didn't exist 2 years ago. Certainly didn't exist 7, 8 years ago.
Oh, for sure, right? And I think, and a lot of it starts with big businesses or the government, and it pushes its way down, right? So, if you're going to do business with JP Morgan, 8, 10 years ago, a SOC 2 might have been sufficient. They're asking for a lot more, right? So a SOC 2 might get you in the door, but they're going to want you to actually line up. They're going to, in their contract, they're going to have an addendum of controls you need to meet in addition to the SOC 2. And those are mostly going to be aligned around ISO or NIST, something more heavyweight, something more risk-based, right? And as part of that, they're going to make you push those controls off to your suppliers. So it's like one domino starts and then they all fall down. And, it's not just that, we're seeing things like FedRAMP, obviously, you mentioned like the gun to your head. Well, one of the possible changes in FedRAMP is everybody that does business with the federal government and your suppliers all the way down the line are going to need to be FedRAMP compliant as well, right? And that's obviously a huge change because it used to be just the person standing at the top of the pyramid actually doing business with the NSA or the CIA or the DoD needed to do FedRAMP, but now it's like, okay, well, are our cloud suppliers FedRAMP compliant? They need to be, right? Or we need to move to cloud suppliers who will be FedRAMP compliant. And that's a huge shift, that's a huge sea change as well.
Yeah, I always think even the risk conversation, I think I would say it's hard, but it varies from business to business. Like if I'm talking to a large financial or an insurance company about risk, they live and breathe risk. They get it at every level. It's not a weird conversation, but a lot of organizations don't really have a good formal risk program for a lot of reasons. I mean, is that sort of a barrier that the entire risk concept is a little alien? Or
I think the concept is, I don't necessarily know that the concept is alien. I think it's the execution of the concept or sort of the first step of the concept that's a little alien, right? So, you're right. Banks have been doing risk and they've had chief risk officers for 30 years now, right? Or 50 years, right? Because they start off in financial risk. And so security risk was just sort of a natural outcropping of that, right? It's like, oh, all right, we already have the mechanism. We've built a culture. We understand how to go there. I think tech companies, because they tend to be very in the cloud. And so things like cyber insurance cause them to think of risk earlier as well. But you're right. When we talk to like legacy manufacturers, or oil and gas companies, or hospitals, or any other industry that's not really in financial or even sort of a smattering of tech, risk is really new to them. And they understand risk, right? You'll go talk to them and they'll say, well, we know we need to, they understand the concept of risk, right? We know we need to do risk. And then you say, okay, where are you? And typically you get one of two answers, right? It's either we haven't started doing it yet, or we have a qualitative risk registry, right? So sort of we've come up with a list of things that can go wrong, but we're not really applying it or scoring it or making it actionable, right? So like we're not even necessarily crawling it, we're just sitting up. But I do think that, these organizations understand that they need to go run, or at least walk. They're just figuring out how to go from sitting to crawling to walking, right? And it's like, okay, we do SOC 2 or we do HIPAA or we do PCI or we do whatever the case is. So we have a control set, right? We test against the controls. We go through an audit mechanism. We either don't have risks or we sort of started risks. What we haven't done is we haven't built that risk to control matrix yet. We haven't scored those risks. We haven't started using the control testing more regularly, not as a function of audit, but as a function of risk mitigation. And that I think that's the challenge for them.
Yeah, I just think there's a growth. It's been sort of coming over the long haul, but just in terms of boards looking at this and the board's understanding it. I think the cyber risk just gets bigger and bigger every year. They see the structures. They're watching 60 Minutes. They're calling. They're like, what does this mean? What are these issues? And they're struggling, and they've been struggling, I think, to find some way of like saying, how do I really know I'm safe as a non-practitioner of cyber? and having this huge issue, like how do I understand? And it's a risk conversation.
Right.
And again, they may or may not be prepared to have it, but I think the boards are getting smarter about it on some level. Do you see boards pushing down to actually get certifications?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that actually is the biggest, I'm smacking myself that I didn't mention it, because that's actually probably the biggest driver in the move to risk that it is, right? Is nobody wants to end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Like nobody in information security wants to end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, right? Your sales leader might want to end up there, your marketing leader or your VP of product, right? But nobody in our line of business wants to be on the Wall Street Journal on page 1 for a breach. That is just career suicide. We saw what happened with Experian and all those other people. And so you're right. There's fiduciary duty, and we're actually seeing at a board level, boards, 2 things, right? Number 1 is boards expect to know about security, and the language that they speak is the language of dollars and the language of risk, right? It's risk versus reward. How much are we spending and what are we getting back? So the other thing too is we've seen an elevation in the CISO from sort of being a back office person who maybe sits under a CTO or a CIO to a fellow executive who will come into the board. And so when the CISO comes into a board meeting, what they're going to talk about is risk, right? And compliance is good in that it's like, hey, here's a third party. So it's not just me sort of blowing smoke at you and saying, yeah, Ken, our information security is strong. I can say, well, whoever, Gotham came in and they agree we have a PCI program. But that doesn't necessarily mean a lot to a board of directors, right? What means a lot is to say, here's our risk, here was our risk last quarter. More importantly, if you can tie risk to business objectives, that's super strong, right? Because if you could say, look, we want to move, one of our core business goals is to sell to the federal government or to process credit cards online or, to take healthcare data, whatever the case is. And our risk around that business objective is this. You can tie it to reward, you can tie it to money. They understand it. So I would agree with you 100%. The driver from boards has actually been one of the biggest ones in terms of getting companies to say, look, we need to move from compliance to risk.
Yeah, and if you're on the other side of this conversation, right? Let's just say you're somebody who's maybe not being pressured to get into some sort of risk mode or structure, whatever. But if you want to kind of sell this up to your management, like what would you present as like the benefits of a good governance risk strategy if you were a CISO reporting to a board who wasn't asking for it? Like how would you sort of position why this is important to the org and why we're going to grow this mature this part of our capability?
Sure. So I would position it sort of 2 ways, right? One would be I position it as forward-looking versus backwards-looking, right? So compliance tends to be relatively reactive, right? You go through an audit, like we said, and that tells you, look, we're doing a good job last year. But that doesn't necessarily tell you you're doing a good job moving forward. And you mentioned, hey, we were PCI QSA, right? The joke is, what the PCI Council said is like nobody who's been breached has ever been in compliance with PCI. And what they mean is, look, you might have had a PCI ROC last year, but at the moment you were breached, you weren't necessarily passing PCI, right? And the reason why is, well, you go through your ROC, you go through your audit once a year, but in between you don't really know what's happening. And so risk is more forward-looking, right? You can have your risks, you can sit there and run an assessment against your risk. You can move into more continuous control testing, and you can on the ground understand, okay, look, here's really where we are at this moment. We're not waiting for an audit. We're not waiting to go look backwards and say, oh, you didn't have software patching in place or you didn't have segregation of duties. We know right away what these risks are coming up with. The second thing is it just really justifies like spend and roadmap, right? Which is super important, because if you go to a board and you say, look, we need to go achieve these things in order to go hit our goals, right, as a company. And that's what a board is talking about all the time. Here's our risk of against each one of these things. That's the language that they understand. And if you say, look, our risk is this, but a little bit of incremental money can bring our risk down from here to here. And here's where sort of we would apply the lever to go do it. And maybe here's where we want to get cyber insurance and go transfer it off or whatever the case is. That's a conversation that a board understands, right? So, really being able to say, look, we want to be more proactive and we really want to use the money that we're spending on information security and not have it be a black box. Because I think that's one of the biggest complaints of boards now is our information security spending keeps going up and up. And you had PCI last year, you had PCI the year before, you had PCI the year before. Why are we spending 25% more every single year? And if you say, look, the footprint of the business is growing, our business goals are growing, and we've actually been able to reduce our risk, or we can benchmark our risk, and here's where we were, that's a very powerful argument to go and make.
Yeah, but and you touched on this, but I mean, I think part of the problem in that conversation is you're talking about this small amount of money. I think people who have historically either been part of an organization who tried to get an ISO cert or tried to get this, like people see this as a very, very large chasm to leap, right? Getting to these structures, getting these things in place, and it's just, you know, it's cost, it's maturity across the whole organization, it's the IT team. So I mean, you know, like, do you feel like it's cheaper now, and why? Do you feel like it's easier now, and why? Like, or do you feel like that people just miss because it does seem like that risk reward ratio, like okay, there's reward, but like the spend, the return on investment is like, okay, I don't, it's that whole, what's the guy, the CISO from Sony, but just before he got breached, I'm not going to spend $8 million solving a $2 million problem. The next week he had an $80 million problem. But, you know, but in this case, like, are we, you know, is it too big a leap to justify the rewards we're going to get?
I mean, that's an interesting question. And I do think that's part of the reason you see things like cyber insurance come out there, right? Because it's not necessarily, you know, you can't go to zero risk, right? That's just impossible. Right. And that's kind of one of the things that we do a lot of coaching with our CISO clients to go tell a board, because they're going to come here and they're going to say, well, we don't ever want to be breached ever. And you're like, look, you know, I can get your car accident risk to zero. Just give me your car keys and never go leave the house. But that's not really you know, that doesn't really take into account the realities of the world, right? So you're always going to have risk out there. You know, the question is sort of, can you use, and this is where I think GRC tooling is really important, is can you build a risk registry? Can you use tooling to understand what your high risks are? Can you connect it to threats in the market? So as it's changing, and so as, you know, your risks change, you can be more dynamic. And then can you spend the money on your high risks to bring those down? And can you transfer what's not there? But there's always going to be some amount of risk that you're just going to have to accept. And that's, you know, that's a challenge, right? Because otherwise, you're right, the leap is too big and it's too expensive. And, you know, the larger the company, the more it's doing digital transformation, the harder it's going to be to take that first step in a way, right? Versus, you know, if you're whatever, an Airbnb or an Uber, you're a cloud native company, right? So it's sort of been baked in for a while. Or if you're a financial institution, you know, this concept of risk has been baked in for a while. If you've never done it, it's hard to take that first step, right? And so can you really understand what your high risk is, and just start off there by knocking down a few high risk things, because then you can get the bang for the buck and you can show some progress.
Yeah, I think, but again, just the politics of it is that as you start this process, like you naturally, and you're supposed to, like, you unearth a lot of problems. You know, start with an inventory of all your critical applications, and then like everyone in the room starts to look like, you know, because they don't know what their critical applications are, they don't have application owners. You know, so you start with this like foundation of like, you're going to unearth a lot of skeletons in this process, right? And I think, you know, but you've got to come into kind of that, okay, so what are our options? Leave them in the dirt, or like start working on this? I mean, is there coaching you give on that, or?
For sure, right? And it's, you know, you made the doctor analogy earlier on. It's like, if you don't go to the doctor for 10 years and nothing's wrong, you know, it's kind of a, hey, see no evil, hear no evil, right? But that doesn't mean that things aren't festering behind the scenes, right? Like, we wouldn't recommend to any, and the analogy we always tell the people is like, look, if you don't go, you know, to the dentist for 4 or 5 years, you may not feel that anything's wrong, but it's going to be a lot more expensive to fix your problems afterwards, right? And an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And believe me, like, the people, you know, we always coach them to use examples, right? The people at Colonial Pipeline, the people at Experian, they probably wish that they'd invested a little bit more in security up front. And you say those names and it starts to open up the board members' eyes. And they're like, we are going to find skeletons, right? It's like going to the doctor and getting blood work. We haven't had it done for a long time. But if we believe in this company and we have a fiduciary responsibility to this company, and we want this company to continue to grow and be successful, and we want this company's brand equity to be worth something, we need to fix these, right? Because our customers, you know, our users put the trust in this company every single day, which means that, like, we need to reward that trust. And the way that we reward that trust is we find out what can go wrong. It's going to be scary. There's going to be a little bit of spend, but the spend, think of it like an investment. The spend today will be far less than the cleanup cost tomorrow.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, you know, you're moving away from that. This is a discipline, right? And it requires some effort and some structure to get into it. And I think, and obviously, like, to your point, many people have been doing it for years and they get it and they understand it. Many new people are being asked to do it. But at the same time, you know, I've heard boards sit around and go, well, my friend down the street just bought, you know, name it product of the week, you know, like, you know, we just put this new firewall, there's new endpoint product, and now we're safe. So can we just go back to that program where we just write a check, buy a new product, and we're safe? I mean, you're kind of, the problem is you're not selling a vaccine, you're selling going to the gym.
Right,
That's a
that's
tough
right.
sell.
And we always tell them, right? It's like, you once you get on the treadmill, you can't get off, right? And so that's
Right,
one
right.
thing that you want to tell them is it's not that this is a one-time, it's not that this is a one-time spend, like an audit, right? You don't just get to do PCI once and walk away from it, right? Like once you commit to doing this, you're making a fundamental change to your business, and it's a fundamental change for the better, right? Like by doing PCI, you get to process credit card data. Hopefully that's unlocking some type of business goal or business value for you, right? Otherwise, maybe there's a different standard or framework you should be looking at. But this is sort of the same thing, right? By doing this, you're sort of, you are going to the gym, right? You're changing your lifestyle. You're not just out there for a quick fix. But I do think one of the things that will probably help on this as well is at least one of the trends we're starting to hear from a lot of CISOs is they believe in the same way, 6-7 years ago, privacy was just sort of a joke. There'd be a privacy statement on the bottom of MySpace or Facebook, and nobody listened to it or took it seriously, and it wasn't enforced. And then all of a sudden, there was GDPR. We went from a world where 5% of the world's population was covered with a privacy regulation to, I think by next year it's going to be like 80 or 90% of the world's population is under privacy. They believe there's going to be a similar cybersecurity legal revolution as well, where it's not that this is a nice to have, it's that this becomes a must have. And the faster you can get in front of it, the cheaper it will be when that comes down the pike, because you've built your systems properly or you started making this transformation as well.
Right. But again, to that point, you've got to see this as an integration with your whole business, with your IT infrastructure. This isn't a layer you put over the top of stuff. Like you don't just keep doing the same old things and put a bunch of binders of documentation up on the shelf and call yourself all a day.
For sure, right? This isn't just writing policies and saying, "Hey, we're done with it," and we sign off on the policies. And we've actually seen this, and I'm sure you guys have too, with a lot of the CISOs you've worked with, right? Like CISO used to be a really back office position, and they were fully responsible for security. We think of the CISO now as more of an enabler and orchestrator, right? The company is responsible for security. What the CISO does is they lead that cultural transformation. But security is everybody's job, right? Because at the end of the day, you or I or whoever, like you're the end user for a lot of your vendors. And so the CISO can put them through a process and make sure that, hey, we're doing business with the right type of people. But take Amazon. Amazon can, supply pencils, or you can go store PHI in there. It's your responsibility to, keep information security in the loop on who your vendors are and how you're working with them, making sure the policies are right, and we're not just think about targets, like everybody's a target now. So it's a lot of training, it's a lot of orchestration, it's a lot of enablement. And this is all the job of a CISO as well, has been really to, move this around.
So how do we break it down? Like, so let's talk about how we eat the elephant. I mean, if you're walking into a new place and you're trying to get them through this in an effective way at a reasonable budget, like what are some of the initial steps? What are things they should maybe do before they even call, a GRC vendor? Like how do we start to think about this? Because again, we're talking about I don't think we're making it sound smaller. We're making it sound bigger.
Right. Yeah.
I don't want to make the chasm sound bigger. But how, what do we do to get started?
So I think the first thing is to be tactical, right? Is to just take a quick understanding and maybe do a gap analysis, right? So understand very quickly, like, okay, let's just take a lay of the land, right? Do we have policies in place? What type of tooling do we have in place? Are we complying with any authoritative sources like a SOC 2 or a PCI or an ISO or NIST? Do we even have a control set in place, right? Because you'd be amazed how many people come in and they're like, oh, we had no security controls in place, right? We had no security policies. If the answer to any or all of those is no, that's okay, right? You want to crawl first. And this is where I would probably go look at like leveraging, a control framework. And this can be like the secure controls framework. This could be a NIST, a CSC top 20 or a CSF. We're probably not going to start off with an 853 that's relatively large and robust, because that's going from nothing to running, right? And I would say the first thing you probably do want to do is you do want to go through this compliance first and just say, look, let's go get a SOC 2 in place or something relatively basic that's not a huge lift to go do. Let's put a control, let's put a set of policies in place, which isn't overly onerous, and you can go get, you can go buy them a lot of places. Let's put a set of controls in place and let's just audit ourselves against a framework just to see how we're going to do. The next step after that I would recommend is let's go build a risk registry, right? A basic risk registry, and let's go tie our risks to controls and just understand what our high risks are. Basic quantification. We're not talking about doing fair or anything onerous. We're just saying we have controls in place, we have policies in place, we have risks in place, and I can tell you what my high risks are, right? And like what controls are in place and if they're passing. After that, that's when you really would start to walk or run. And that I think depends on your business and your board and your relationship with them and your mandate. And, that's when you get into sort of the politics and the coaching and the budget and saying, look, this is nice, but, to really sort of support our business and the growth of our business and our business initiatives, we need to go take this up to another level. But I always tell people start small.
I just want to back you up though, because so all the way back to the SOC 2 where you started,
Yep.
like, is that something you think you can do like, do you start with that and sort of internally? Does that take weeks, months? Like what, how much budget do I put into that? Like, how because I think a lot of times, like, these things start and they're kind of like somebody's third assignment, and they don't take off. Like, what, that first step, like, what does it look and feel like in terms of investment, in terms of time frames, in terms, like, how do I, and I know that varies organization to organization, but how should people think about how that gets started and doesn't just turn into a wish?
So I would say there's two things, right? There's sort of scope and there's time. And scope, like, all these frameworks have different scope. And essentially, you think of it almost like going to college, right? You could take the bare minimum of credits, or you could sort of take significantly more credits and, double major, right? What we always tell people is keep it simple, right? We're not going for a double major here. We're not picking up a master's degree, right? Like, what's a bare minimum of scope? And this is the, what you alluded to earlier, kind of PCI, like, what lines can you draw around this to really keep the scope small, right? Because we're not trying to boil the ocean our first time through. If you think about something like SOC 2, for instance, you could do a type 1 or a type 2. A type 2 covers a full year. We're not really trying to wait a full year. We're just doing a type 1, which is a couple months, just to see, look, where do we stand right now, right? So can we take just that first initial step? And if you narrow the timeline and you narrow the scope, somebody does need to be in charge of this. You're right. This isn't just a sort of, hey, we're going to throw this out in the ether to the CTO, and the CTO is going to go do this sort of on his off time, or, this is going to take one engineer or whatever. This is, you're probably devoting a body to it. And this doesn't need to be a CISO, right? This can be somebody relatively low level, or this could be something that you outsource. And this is a great thing, as a VAR to be able to go help with. But this is where we want to go take that first step and just understand where we're at. We want to keep it relatively small, because what we're really curious about are the findings. What comes out of this? What aren't we doing that we should be doing? And that's where we can start to take the next step and get a little bit bigger.
Right. It's hard to get I think you have to need, I'm sure you need management support, because a lot of this is just questions, and like, you got to get answers to your questions. I tell customers, like, look, it'll take what it'll take, because I'll have a lot of questions and the answers might take 2 days, they might take 2 months, but we'll need answers.
And I mean, the other thing too is it's management support, because it's also going to be, for better or worse, disruptive on the rest of the business, right? Like, this one person that you bring in to go ask, all this person is doing is they're really taking the questions from the auditor, seeing what they can answer themselves, but they're facilitating the rest of the organization answering these questions, right? Because, somebody who comes in at information security, they're not going to know, what your HR, they're not going to be able to go pull a security log or do a QAR or, employee onboarding or offboarding. So they're basically going to say, okay, look, I've got to go to HR and tap HR on the shoulder about these policies. And more importantly, I've got to go to development, right, where the costs are more. And I've got to go tap, my engineers on the shoulder or DevOps on the shoulder, and I've got to go pull these logs or these files or whatever the case is. And so it's really this push from management that this is something that's important to go do. Now, I think the one benefit here is a lot of this time, this tends to drive revenue. So you can get allies in the C-suite, right? So you made the analogy earlier, hey, we do a SOC 2 because it helps with sales. You're absolutely right? That's one of the biggest things, is when the VP of sales or the chief revenue officer says, guys, look, we're losing deals because we don't have that SOC 2 certification. That's a great reason to suddenly go get that buy-in from management to say, look, our revenue can go up by 10% or 20% or 50% or whatever the case is. If we can go get this SOC 2, right? So a lot of it is coaching and it's management change. And again, it's just saying, look, we're going to go to the gym, right? We've got to carve time out of our day. We've got to accept that this is sort of the new normal. We don't need to go to the gym 7 days a week. We don't need to go look like Arnold Schwarzenegger 40 years ago, right? We just need to, we're just trying to pick up a healthy habit here. Maybe it's not even going to the gym. Maybe it's just walking around the block every day to start.
Yeah. It's also, I think, one of the things I try to tell clients is you need to sort of control your reactions, in the sense that, like, you're going to find a lot of stuff that's going to be uncomfortable.
Yep.
And as you find uncomfortable stuff, you need to not take the person that just answered the questionnaire out back behind the woodshed for a beating, because there's going to be more and more of that stuff, and you're just not going to get truth and whatever. It's to me, I always used to think, I'm like, remember when you first installed vulnerability management and you ran your environment and it showed up like a Christmas tree, like bright red with 1,000 critical alerts? I'm like, on some level, this is going to be similar. We're going to find a bunch of stuff and we will fix it, but we don't need to run around like our hair's on fire, screaming at everyone about all these things we just found out about. We'll just create a rational effort around it. And I think that
That's right.
controlling the scope of the reaction, I think is important for the process as well.
100%, right? And we always tell people is, look, your organization, you want to say this is evolutionary, not revolutionary, right? Like what we always tell CISOs or information security people is, we're not here to say no. What we're here to say is yes, but, right? So can I work with this vendor? Yes, but just make sure they're secure. Yes, but just let me know if your scope with them changes. And I think it's exactly that, is we're not taking people out behind the woodshed. It's just evolutionary change. So, okay, hey, last year we didn't have any type of anti-phishing software in place. All right, we're going to put something in place and we're going to go through training, right? We're not going to go crazy. We're not going to sit there and maybe go buy the gamut of software. We're just going to look again at like what our highest risks or what our findings that came out were, and we're going to go patch those. And then next year when those come up, we'll go fix them again, and we'll get a little bit better every single cycle, every single control test, every single audit, every single year. And over time, you end up in a state that's goes from sort of nowhere to being acceptable to being good.
Yeah, and does it get in? So I kind of stopped you right at that crawl stage. You're in the middle of the crawl. So as you move up to like sort of the walk and run, does the organization get bigger? Like how does that change? What can they expect as they kind of get more mature with it?
Yeah, so I would say two things. So number one is the organization gets bigger. Number two is the information security organization gets bigger, right? And it's one of those things, if you kind of look at like a startup when it starts, startups tend to, when they start, they have two functions, right? You have a sales function, like people who are going out there and making money, and you have like an engineering function, right? People who are going out there and basically building the product. Over time, as a company grows, you add that G&A function, right? Because you need HR, you need operations, you need all that stuff. And that's kind of like where information security is going to come in. Is it's going to be one of those things where, you should be taking security from the get-go, but as you move from, in a company from the crawl to a walk to a run, that's where like a CISO is really going to come in. It's no longer necessarily rolling up to a CTO with, it's not you, Ken, with an analyst underneath you. There's a CISO, right? And then the CISO is a peer of yours, right? And then the CISO goes and reports to the board, and then the CISO is a team underneath them. And you move from a compliance-based approach to a risk-based approach. And this stuff is evolutionary. It's not that you snap your fingers and there's a 15-person information security team there overnight, right? And you're going through 853. But, over time, it's like, okay, we have a CISO. Okay, the CISO is going to come to the board. The CISO is going to say, look, we don't know what our risk is, but we're doing compliance. Then the CISO is going to come to a board and say, yeah, here's our risk registry. Then the CISO is going to come to a board and say, here's our high risks. Then the CISO is going to come to a board and say, here's our high risks against our different business objectives. And here's what we're doing against each one of them, right? And then, it becomes conversations about things like cyber insurance and stuff like that. And right. This takes spend, right? It takes time, there's no doubt about it. But, nobody wants to be Colonial Pipeline, which is sort of the flip side of this, right? And that's why you invest in this.
Right. I mean, to the extent that we're changing culture and we've got a risk-based culture, and that's effectively how we're making these decisions, I think that resonates pretty well with me and probably with most people. I think what's concern, or what, I don't say sounds scary, but is a concern, is that sometimes I feel like these things take a life of their own. And it's probably like this, I think historically, of like some of whatever, I'll say, like, there's a group of like 50 people that do nothing but sit in Archer all day, like just changing shit and doing stuff, and it's so I'm like, I think there's a question like, is this really valuable to the org, or is this just its own beast over living in the corner here that we have to feed with more and more FTEs?
Well, for sure, right, and that I think has been one of the big changes we've seen in GRC, has been this shift from this old enterprise software where care and feeding, I would guess in many cases took more effort than the value you got out of the tool, right? And we've seen this in a lot of industries. It's like, you went from CRM with a PeopleSoft that was very complex and brittle and hard to set up, to a Salesforce, to now even things that might be a little bit simpler, a little easier. And that's exactly the same trend we're seeing in GRC as well. And tooling is, this is moving from hey, look, we're just taking spreadsheet. Archer was basically just taking all the different spreadsheets and emails that people had and took all these tactical things that almost had nothing in common, right? Like, here's policies. Let's go put our policies in one place and let's go make sure that we're tracking them and signing off on them. Here's vulnerabilities. Let's go build a vulnerability scanner over here. Now third party, we've got to go build stuff for third party. And like, how do you put those together? And the answer was there wasn't really a good way, which is why it was so complicated. So we're seeing agile tools, right? And like the time to value for GRC, we've seen it going from a year or more with Archer, right? I mean, I talked to somebody, the CISO at Monsanto, and it was like, we bought Archer about 10 years ago. After 5 years and $4 million, my predecessor, and obviously this is predecessor, all we had was a list of, policies in Archer, right? We're seeing people go from that to stuff that took 3 months to set up. And now, in our new version of our tool, you can get up and running in 30 minutes, right? So we're really trying to move to this SaaS speed deployment where it's like, hey, what do you want to comply with? What are your risks? Okay, much more prescriptive, connect your applications, and you start getting value right away.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it helps on some level just because things change so often, and compliance rules change, things happen.
Sure.
At least being cloud-based, you're plugged into all that stuff. So it's not like it's an on-prem deployment. I mean, that must help you guys to some extent, just having that kind of a library that's online.
I mean, it helps us tremendously, right, on two folds. I would say one is being cloud-based enables us to plug into cloud-based tools. So, we can give you much more of a continuous compliance version. We're not saying, hey, every quarter we're going to go send an email to your DevOps person and go ask your DevOps person to go onto Amazon and go pull the password complexity log or, whatever the case is. We're saying is, look, we're going to hook into Amazon and we're going to pull that data all the time, right? So all the time you've got the right data. We're also saying, look, because this is cloud-based, to your point, like we have all the regulations behind the scenes. And, when PCI moves from 3.2.1 to 4.0, we have 4.0 in your tool. So you can just click there to go deploy it. It's not a solution. It's not a module. It's not a software update. It's there for you instantly, right? And I think really the exciting thing is as we move forward, things like AI to not only say we're going to go gather that evidence for you, we're going to say, look, this password policy, you needed to have 12 characters. We've noticed you've gone from 12 characters to 2 characters because maybe somebody mistyped or missed a symbol. But because this control is linked to your risks, we can tell you, hey, this control turned red. These risks that might have been lower that you don't worry about are suddenly high. You need to go think about risk in real time, right? And I think that's really the benefit for people isn't just saying, look, our risk of breach is this. It's saying our risk of breach now is high. Here's the corrective action that we can go take. And here's the preventative action moving forward we can do to not get in this situation. But yeah, I think it's a cloud-based and the integrations, right?
Yeah, it would look the whole cloud. Again, like some of the traditional sort of concepts around these risk-based structures, the NIST structures, whatever, like they're not thinking about the way things work today. Like, there's like, give me a server inventory with a list of IP addresses. I'm like, that's not how the cloud works. Like that, like the entire the spreadsheet model of the world, like the concept of inventories, all these things have changed massively. So if you're not sort of coded to understand how that's going to work on a rules level, on a DevOps level, to your point, you're not ready to really be compliant, and you're just going to frustrate everybody by trying to make them into 1990s IT. It's just not going to work.
And that's what we hear from a lot of, not necessarily CISOs, but like CTOs and VPs of engineering is they're like, look, the CISO bought MetricStream or Archer or some old school tool, and they are coming to me and they're asking me for a list of assets. Like, I use the cloud, right? We're spinning up servers nonstop. Like, how many do we have? Well, it just depends what point and what day you happen to get us at. And that number is going to be drastically different a day or a week or a month later. And we, we don't so much care about the list. What we care about is the risk against this. And more importantly, like, how does this relate to what we're going to do, right? Can we talk about that instead? And so I agree. I think, cloud-based, if you're using tools in the cloud, your GRC tool pretty much has to be in the cloud to be successful, right? I think otherwise there's too much dissonance between them. It's like you're basically out there with a pen and paper trying to audit something that's, in physical, off of the cloud. Right. It doesn't work.
You're any questions like how many angels dance in the head of a pen? I'm like, as many as you want. You have heard of auto scaling, right? So anyway, yes, that's terrific. So anyway, just we're kind of close on a little bit because I'm going to about 45 minutes to do something. Maybe just paint a picture for me. Like, what does this look like when it's done right? We talked about some of the challenges. We talked about some of the stuff. I mean, is there like an example you can think of in your head when it's right? If this is how it's looking. So what does it look like when it's good?
Yeah. So what we always recommend to people is, you think about like a security operations center or a SOC. What you should have is a risk operations center, right? That like you as a CISO or a high level person can log into every single week. And what you should be able to see is two things. What you should be able to see is one thing. You should be able to see your risk against each one of your business goals, but you should be able to do two things with that. One is take it upwards, right, to your fellow executives or to the board of directors and say, we're not just FedRAMP because FedRAMP doesn't mean anything to them. Our, 20% of our sales comes from the federal government. Here's our risk against that 20% of that sales, right? Here's our controls against that. The other thing you should be able to do is go downwards with it, right? And say, look, our risk changes much this, week over week or month over month, or since the last time I logged in. This is what I've noticed has gone wrong. I want you guys to go fix this, right? And a GRC tool, if you think about security, there's all these different security tools. And they go very deep, right? So it's like, look, we put in a firewall. Well, the firewall is fixing this one specific problem, or anti-phishing software is fixing this one specific problem. GRC doesn't go deep. GRC sits across. It's a single pane of glass, right? And GRC isn't going to fix any problems on its own. But what GRC is going to do is it's going to unify all those tools into one single pane of glass. So you can say, oh, here's our problem. Go do this to go fix that, right? And if you use it right, you should be able to see all of your risks, and you should understand where your problems lie so you can go fix it and make sure that you're burning down your risk appropriately. If you can't burn it down, okay, let's go out there and get cyber insurance, or let's go fix it. But you really, if you use GRC properly, there shouldn't be a lot of surprises. That should be the goal.
That's great, because I hate surprises.
Yeah, right. Nobody wants to be surprised. Surprises are good. Sales and security are two areas where surprises tend to be very, very bad, right? So yeah.
Awesome. Does anybody on have any questions? And it's about I've got about 45 minutes here. Are there any questions from any of the attendees? If you turn your mic on and just talk. No. Anything on Rob? Anything I should have asked you that you're dying to get out?
No, this is great, Ken. We really appreciate it. We really enjoy our partnership with Gotham. We look at you guys as a wonderful partner. We want to be there to support you. And if you don't know a lot about Reciprocity, we'd urge you to go visit reciprocity.com. And I would actually say for you, for clients who are on here, maybe don't know about Gotham, do you want to just give us a quick overview of who you are?
Most people are Gotham customers. Yeah, Gotham's is a regional reseller in the New York City area, but we do service people all across the globe doing cybersecurity, cloud, staffing sources, a variety of solutions. But I think this space is very interesting for us, because, like I said, I see a lot of customers, who are traditionally in it that are struggling with their traditional tool sets, and I see a lot of customers kind of moving into it. And I think my goal for today was really to get people to understand that this is a doable thing, it's a worthwhile thing, and it's something that they, a framework that they can accept in the long run. To your point, if you've got that risk framework and that pane of glass, you're going to have an easier time talking to your board about how this works and understanding what you're really achieving from a cyber perspective. So I think I'm hoping everybody got some good data from that today.
And as far as Gotham's offerings, around risk and compliance, because I know we've worked with you, so we're intimately familiar with that. But what do you think about sort of your core competency around risk and compliance, and what do you guys offer and want to offer to all of your clients?
Yeah, like I said, so we've traditionally been a PCI QSA. We've been helping people in sort of some of the risk structures, and we've been helping customers recently move to FedRAMP, move to different things that they're choosing. So to me, I think it's the setting of tools like you guys that are part of it, that are foundationally part of it, and it's covering the gap in a number of ways for us. We have security as a managed service that we offer. We help them, with different aspects of what they might be missing from those structures. We help them some different offerings in the cloud security area. So, our goal is to basically be an integrator, right? We sell tools and we help those tools achieve value. And so providing the extra consulting work to get the GRCs up and running, but additionally, like looking what those remediation factors are, because there's always a list of things to do that your staff doesn't have time to do. And that we come in and kind of help clean that up, get the inventories together, fix up whatever it is that you don't have, add the capabilities that you need, and kind of do that as a managed service. So I think that, to me, that's our role going forward, is sort of this integrator. You're really not just a piece of software, you're a service, right? And I think as an integrator of services, that makes Gotham a strong partner, because we're providing that umbrella all of this and making sure you're getting to where you need to be as a client. So excellent. Thanks for the question, Rob. Cool. All right. So I think we're about done here, unless anybody wants to jump on one last second thing here. No, I think that's good. Rob, thanks so much for this. I think it worked out great. I'm sure people learned a lot, and I'm sure you and I will talk again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Ken, and thank you to everybody who attended.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.